Welcome to How to Econ. Today, we will go over the topics of monopolies such as how monopolies form, how a profit-maximizing monopoly chooses output and price, regulating anti-competitive behaviors, and regulating natural monopolies. Monopoly is a market with no competition at all, and firms have a great deal of market power. There's only one firm who produces all of the output in a market. Since a monopoly faces no significant competition, it can charge any price it wishes subject to the demand curve. While a monopoly by definition refers to a single firm, in practice, people often use the term to describe a market in which one firm has a significantly high market share. This tends to be the definition that the US Department of Justice uses. Even though there are very few true monopolies in existence, we do deal with some of those few every day, often without realizing it. The US Postal Service, your electricity, and garbage collection companies are a few examples. Some new drugs are produced by only one pharmaceutical firm for some years, and no close substitutes for that drug may exist. Monopoly exists because of barriers to entry. Barriers to entry are the legal, technological, or market forces that discourage or prevent potential competitors from entering a market. Barriers to entry can range from the simple and easily surmountable, such as the cost of renting retail space, to the extremely restrictive. For example, there are a finite number of radio frequencies available for broadcasting. Once an entrepreneur or firm has purchased the rights to all of them, no new competitors can enter the market. In some cases, barriers to entry may lead to monopoly. In other cases, they may limit competition to a few firms. Barriers may block entry even if the firm or firms currently in the market are earning profits. Thus, in markets with significant barriers to entry, it is not necessarily true that abnormally high profits will attract new firms and that this entry of new firms will eventually cause the price to decline so that surviving firms earn only a normal level of profit in the long run. There are two types of monopoly based on the types of barriers to entry they exploit. One is natural monopoly, where the barriers to entry are something other than legal prohibition. The other is legal monopoly, where laws prohibit or severely limit competition. Natural monopolies often arise in industries where the marginal cost of adding an additional customer is very low once the fixed costs of the overall system are in place. This results in situations where there are substantial economies of scale. For example, once a water company lays the main water pipes through a neighborhood, the marginal cost of providing water service to another home is fairly low. Or once the electric company installs lines in a new subdivision, the marginal cost of providing additional electrical service to one more home is minimal. It would be costly and duplicative for a second water company to enter the market and invest in a whole second set of main water pipes, or for a second electricity company to enter the market and invest in a whole new set of electrical wires. This industry is often an example where, because of economies of scale, one producer can serve the entire market more efficiently than a number of smaller producers that would need to make duplicate physical capital investment. A natural monopoly can also arise in smaller local markets for products that are difficult to transport. For example, cement production exhibits economies of scale and the quantity of cement demanded in a local area may not be much larger than what a single plant can produce. Moreover, the costs of transporting cement over land are high, and so a cement plant in an area without access to water transportation may be a natural monopoly. Another type of monopoly occurs when a company has control of a scarce physical resource. In the US economy, one historical example of this pattern occurred when the Aluminum Company of America controlled most of the supply of bauxite, a key mineral used in making aluminum. Back in the 1930s, when this company controlled most of the bauxite, other firms were simply unable to produce enough aluminum to compete. As another example, the majority of global diamond production is controlled by De Beers, a multinational company that has mining and production operations in South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, and Canada. It also has exploration activities on 4 continents while directing a worldwide distribution network of rough-cut diamonds. For some products, the government erects barriers to entry by prohibiting or limiting competition. Under U.S. law, no organization but the U.S. Postal Service is legally allowed to deliver first-class mail. Many states or cities have laws or regulations that allow households a choice of only one electric company, one water company, and one company to pick up the garbage. Most legal monopolies are utilities, products necessary for everyday life that are socially beneficial. As a consequence, the government allows producers to become regulated monopolies to ensure that customers have access to an appropriate amount of these products or services. Additionally, legal monopolies are often subject to economies of scale, so it makes sense to allow only one provider. For example, Bell Telephone Company was allowed to dominate the telecommunication products and services in North America for 100 years, from its creation in 1877 until its antitrust breakup in 1983. Innovation takes time and resources to achieve. Suppose a company invests in research and development and finds the cure for the common cold. In this world of near-ubiquitous information, other companies could take the formula, produce the drug, and because they did not incur the costs of research and development, undercut the price of the company that discovered the drug. Given this possibility, many firms would choose not to invest in research and development, and as a result, the world would have less innovation. A patent gives the inventor the exclusive legal right to make, use, or sell the invention for a limited time. In the United States, exclusive patent rights last for 20 years. The idea is to provide limited monopoly power so that innovative firms can recoup their investment in R&D, but then to allow other firms to produce the product more cheaply once the patent expires. A trademark is an identifying symbol or name for a particular good, like Chevrolet cars or the Nike swoosh that appears on shoes and athletic gear. A firm can renew a trademark repeatedly as long as it remains in active use. A copyright, according to the U.S. Copyright Office, is a form of protection provided by the laws of the United States for original works of authorship, including literary, dramatic, musical, architectural, cartographic, choreographic, pantomimic, graphic, sculptural, and audiovisual creations. No one can reproduce, display, or perform a copyright work without the author's permission. Copyright protection ordinarily lasts for the life of the author plus 70 years. Roughly speaking, patent law covers inventions and copyright protects books, songs, and art. However, in certain areas, like the invention of new software, it has been unclear whether patent or copyright protection should apply. There's also a body of law known as trade secrets. Even if a company does not have a patent on an invention, competing firms are not allowed to steal the secrets. One famous trade secret is the formula for Coca-Cola, which is not protected under copyright or patent law, but is simply kept secret by the company. Taken together, we call this combination of patents, trademarks, copyrights, and trade secret law intellectual property because it implies ownership over an idea, concept, or image, not a physical piece of property like a house or a car. They are barriers to entry that create monopoly. Businesses have developed a number of schemes for creating barriers to entry by deterring potential competitors from entering the market. One method is known as predatory pricing, in which a firm uses the threat of sharp price cuts to discourage competition. Predatory pricing is a violation of U.S. antitrust law, but it is difficult to prove. A commonly proposed rule is that if a firm is selling for less than its average variable cost, that is, at a price where it should be shutting down, then there is evidence for predatory pricing. However, calculating in the real world what costs are variable and what costs are fixed is often not obvious either. Innovation and improvements in production technologies led to a wave of deregulation starting in the late 1970s and continuing into the 1990s. This wave eliminated or reduced government restrictions on the firms that could enter, the prices that they could charge, and the quantities that many industries produce, including telecommunications, airlines, trucking, banking, and electricity. Consider a monopoly firm comfortably surrounded by barriers to entry so that it needs not to fear competition from other producers. How will this monopoly choose its profit-maximizing quantity of output, and what price will it charge? Profits for the monopolist, like any firm, will be equal to total revenues minus total cost. We can analyze the pattern of cost for the monopoly within the same framework as the cost of a perfectly competitive firm. However, because a monopoly faces no competition, its situation and its decision process will differ from that of a perfectly competitive firm. Let's take a look at these two graphs. The one on the left shows the demand curve of a perfectly competitive firm. This firm acts as a price taker, so we calculate total revenue by taking the given market price and multiply it with the quantity of output that the firm chooses. A monopolist receives the demand curve that it faces to be the same as the market demand curve, which for most products is downward sloping as shown in the graph on the right. Thus, if the monopolist chooses a high level of output, let's say QH, it can charge only a relatively low price PL. Conversely, if the monopolist chooses a low level of output QL, it can then charge a higher price PH. While a monopolist can charge any price for its product, nonetheless, the demand for the firm's products constrains the price. No monopolist that is thoroughly protected by high barriers to entry can require consumers to purchase its product. The challenge for the monopolist is to choose the combination of price and quantity that maximize profits. We can illustrate profits for monopolists with a graph of total revenues and total costs with the example of a hypothetical firm. Total costs rise and the curve grows steeper as output increases. Total revenue for the monopoly firm first rises, then falls. Low levels of output bring in relatively little total revenue because the quantity is low. High levels of output bring in relatively less revenue because the high quantity pushes down the market price. Profits will be highest at the quantity of output where total revenue is most above total cost. The profit maximizing level of output is not the same as the revenue maximizing level of output, which should make sense because profits take cost into account and revenues do not. This looks to be somewhere in the middle of the graph, but where exactly? It is easier to see the profit maximizing level of output by using the marginal approach, to which we turn next. In the real world, a monopolist often does not have enough information to analyze its entire total revenues or total cost curves. After all, the firm does not know exactly what would happen if it were to alter production dramatically. However, a monopolist often has fairly reliable information about how changing output by small or moderate amounts will affect its marginal revenues and marginal costs because it has had experience with such changes over time and because modest changes are easier to extrapolate from current experience. A monopolist can use information on marginal revenue and marginal cost to seek out the profit-maximizing combination of quantity and price. Let's look at an example of a hypothetical monopolist again. This monopoly faces typical upward sloping marginal cost and downward sloping marginal revenue curves. Notice that marginal revenue is 0 at a quantity of 7 and turns negative at quantities higher than 7. It may seem counterintuitive that marginal revenue could ever be 0 or negative. After all, doesn't an increase in quantity sold not always mean more revenue? For a perfect competitor, each additional unit sold brought a positive marginal revenue because marginal revenue was equal to the given market price. However, a monopolist can sell a large quantity and see a decline in total revenue. When a monopolist increases sales by 1 unit, it gains some marginal revenue from selling that extra unit, but also loses some marginal revenue because it must now sell every other unit at a lower price. As the quantity sold become higher, at some point, the drop in price is proportionally more than the increase in greater quantity of sales, causing a situation where more sales bring in less revenue. In other words, marginal revenue is negative. The profit maximizing choice for the monopoly will be to produce at the quantity of 5, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, that is, MR equals MC. If the monopoly produces a lower quantity, then marginal revenue MR is larger than marginal cost MC at those levels of output, and the firm can make higher profits by expanding output. If the firm produces at a greater quantity, then MC is larger than MR, and the firm can make higher profits by reducing its quantity of output. It is straightforward to calculate profits by deducting total cost out of total revenue. However, the size of monopoly profits can also be illustrated graphically as you see on the screen here. This graph takes the marginal cost and marginal revenue curves of our hypothetical firm from the previous slide and adds an average cost curve and the monopolist's perceived demand curve. This monopoly firm first chooses the quantity where MR equals MC. In this example, the quantity is 5. It is marked by the red Q star on the horizontal axis. The monopolist then decides what price to charge by looking at the demand curve it faces. The red P star on the vertical axis marks the price. The large box with quantity Q star on the horizontal axis and price P star on the vertical axis shows total revenue for the firm. The lighter shaded box, which is quantity Q star on the horizontal axis and average cost of production on the vertical axis, shows the firm's total cost. The large total revenue box minus the smaller total cost box leaves the darkly shaded box that shows total profits. Since the price charged is above average cost, the firm is earning positive profits. The marginal revenue curves for a monopolist always lies beneath the market demand curve. To understand why, think about increasing the quantity along the demand curve by 1 unit, so that you take one step down the demand curve to a slightly higher quantity but a slightly lower price. Remember that a demand curve is not sequential. It is not that first we sell Q1 at a higher price and then we sell Q2 at a lower price. Rather, a demand curve is conditional. If we charge the higher price, we could sell Q1. If instead we charge a lower price on all units that we sell, we would sell Q2. When we think about increasing the quantity sold by 1 unit, marginal revenue is affected in 2 ways. First, we sell 1 additional unit at the new market price. Second, all the previous units which we sold at the higher price now sell for less. Because of the lower price on all units sold, the marginal revenue of selling a unit is less than the price of that unit, and the marginal revenue curve is below the demand curve. This figure illustrates the general 3-step process where a monopolist selects the profit maximizing quantity to produce, decides what price to charge, determines total revenue, total cost, and profit. Step 1. The monopolist determines its profit maximizing level of output. The firm can use the points on the demand curve D to calculate total revenue and then, based on total revenue, calculate its marginal revenue curve. The profit maximizing quantity will occur where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. MR equals MC, or at the last possible point before marginal costs start exceeding marginal revenue. In this example, MR equals MC occurs at an output of 5. Step 2. The monopolist decides what price to charge. The monopolist will charge what the market is willing to pay. A dotted line drawn straight up from the profit maximizing quantity to the demand curve shows the profit maximizing price, which is $800 per unit. This price is above the average cost curve, which shows that the firm is earning profit. Step 3. Calculate total revenue, total cost, and total profit. Total revenue is the overall shaded box where the width of the box is the quantity sold and the height is the price. This is 5 times $800 equals $4,000. The bottom part of the shaded box, which is shaded more lightly, shows total cost. That is quantity on the horizontal axis multiplied by average cost on the vertical axis, or 5 times $330 equals $1,650. The larger box of total revenues minus the smaller box of total cost will equal profits, which is shown by the darkly shaded box. Using the numbers, we have $4,000 minus $1,650, we have $2,350 for profit. In a perfectly competitive market, the forces of entry could erode this profit in the long run. However, a monopolist is protected by barriers to entry. In fact, one obvious sign of a possible monopoly is when a firm earns profits year after year while doing more or less the same thing without ever seeing increased competition eroding those profits. Most people criticize monopolies because they charge too high a price, but what economists object to is that monopolies do not supply enough output to be allocatively efficient. To understand why a monopoly is inefficient, it is useful to compare it with the benchmark model of perfect competition. The rule of profit maximization in a world of perfect competition was for each firm to produce the quantity of output where price equals marginal cost, where the price is a measure of how much buyers value the good and the marginal cost is a measure of what marginal units cost society to produce. Following this rule assures allocative efficiency, which is an economic concept regarding efficiency at the social level. It refers to producing the optimal quantity of some output where the marginal benefit to society of one more unit just equals the marginal cost. In the case of monopoly, price is always greater than marginal cost at the profit maximizing level of output. Therefore, consumers will suffer because a monopolist will sell a lower quantity in the market at a higher price than would have been the case in a perfectly competitive market. So monopoly creates a deadweight loss for society. The problem of inefficiency for monopolies often runs even deeper than these issues and also involves incentives for efficiency over longer periods of time. There are counterbalancing incentives here. On one side, firms may strive for new inventions and new intellectual property because they want to become monopolies and earn high profits, at least for a few years until the competition catches up. In this way, monopolies may come to exist because of competitive pressures on firms. However, once a barrier to entry is in place, a monopoly that does not need to fear competition can just produce the same old products in the same old way while still ringing up a healthy rate of profit. John Hicks, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1972, wrote that the best of all monopoly profits is a quiet life. He meant that monopolies may bank their profits and slack off on trying to please their customers. Since a merger or acquisition combines two firms into one, it can reduce the extent of competition between firms and lead to monopoly or abuse of monopoly power. Before a large merge happens, the antitrust regulators at the FTC and the U.S. Department of Justice can allow the merge, prohibit it, or allow it if certain conditions are met. One common condition is that the merge will be allowed if the firm agrees to sell off certain parts. The laws that give government the power to block certain mergers, and even in some cases to break up large firms into smaller ones, are called antitrust laws. Some historical antitrust laws in the US are the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, Clayton Antitrust Act 1914, and Seller-Kefauver Act 1950. However, the fundamental belief behind a market-oriented economy is that firms, not governments, are in the best position to know if their actions will lead to attracting more customers or producing more efficiently. Government regulators agree that most mergers are beneficial to consumers by allowing firms to operate more efficiently. At the same time, the FTC recognizes that some mergers are likely to lessen competition that in turn can lead to higher prices, reduced availability of goods or services, lower quality of products, and less innovation. Some mergers create a concentrated market, while others enable a single firm to raise prices. The challenge for the antitrust regulators at the FTC and the US Department of Justice is to figure out when a merge may hinder competition. This decision involves both numerical tools and some judgments that are difficult to quantify. Regulators have struggled for decades to measure the degree of monopoly power in an industry. An early tool was the concentration ratio, which measures the combined market share, or percent of total industry sales, which account for the largest firms, typically the top 4 to 8 firms. A 4-firm concentration ratio is a simple tool which may reveal only part of the story. For example, consider 2 industries that both have a 4-firm concentration ratio of 80. However, in one industry, 5 firms each hold 20% of the market, while in the other industry, the top firm holds 77% of the market and all the other firms have 1% each. Although the 4-firm concentration ratios are identical, it could be reasonable to worry more about the extent of competition in the second case, where the largest firm is nearly a monopoly, than in the first. Another approach to measuring industry concentration that can distinguish between these two cases is called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, HHI. We calculate the HHI by summing the squares of the market share of each firm in the industry. The closer a market is to a monopoly, the higher the market's concentration and the lower its competition. If, for example, there were only one firm in an industry, that firm would have 100% market share and the HHI would equal 10,000, indicating a monopoly. If there were thousands of firms competing, each would have nearly 0% market share and the HHI would be close to 0, indicating nearly perfect competition. The US Department of Justice considers a market with an HHI of less than 1,500 to be a competitive market, an HHI of 1,500 to 2,500 to be a moderately concentrated market, and an HHI of 2,500 or greater to be a highly concentrated marketplace. As a general rule, mergers that increase the HHI by more than 200 points in highly concentrated markets raise antitrust concerns, as they are assumed to enhance market power. The third method is using the Lerner index, which is the ratio of markup per unit and price per unit of a product or service. Markup is the difference between the selling price and cost. In this case, we are using marginal cost. The closer the index is to 0, the closer it is to perfect competition, because in that case, firms have to set the price as low as possible to compete. On the other hand, the closer Lerner index is to 1, the higher market power the seller has. Both the 4-firm concentration ratios and the HHI methods share some weaknesses. First, they begin from the assumption that the market under discussion is well defined and the only question is measuring how sales are divided in that market. Attempting to define a particular market can be difficult and controversial due to technology development and globalization. Second, they are based on an implicit assumption that competitive conditions across industries are similar enough that a broad measure of concentration in the market is enough to make a decision about the effects of a merge. These assumptions, however, are not always correct. Moreover, a drawback of the Lerner Index is that while it is relatively easy to observe a firm's prices, it is quite difficult to measure its marginal cost. In response to these problems, the antitrust regulators have been changing their approach in the last decade or two. The Federal Trade Commission (FTC) has begun to look less at market share and more at the data on actual competition between businesses. This new approach to antitrust regulation involves detailed analysis of specific markets and companies instead of defining a market and counting up total sales. A common starting point is for antitrust regulators to use statistical tools and real-world evidence to estimate the demand curves and supply curves the firms proposing a merge face. A second step is to specify how competition occurs in this specific industry. Some possibilities include competing to cut prices, to raise output, to build a brand name through advertising, and to build a reputation for good service or high quality. With this pieces of the puzzle in place, it is then possible to build a statistical model that estimates the likely outcome for consumers if the two firms are allowed to merge. These models do require some degree of subjective judgment, and so they can become the subject of legal disputes between the antitrust authorities and the companies that wish to merge. Please keep in mind that under U.S. antitrust laws, monopoly itself is not illegal. If a firm has a monopoly because of a newly patented invention, for example, the law explicitly allows a firm to earn higher than normal profits for a time as a reward for innovation. If a firm achieves a large share of market by producing a better product at a lower price, such behavior is not prohibited by antitrust law. But U.S. antitrust laws include rules against some restrictive practices. They are practices that do not involve outright agreements to raise price or to reduce the quantity produced, but that might have the effect of reducing competition. Antitrust cases involving restrictive practices are often controversial because they delve into specific contracts or agreements between firms that are allowed in some cases but not in others. Some restrictive practices are minimum resale price, maintenance agreement, which requires the dealer who buys from a manufacturer to sell for at least a certain minimum price, or exclusive dealing, which is an agreement that a dealer will sell only products from one manufacturer. Another example is tying sales, happen when a customer is allowed to buy one product only if the customer also buys another product. A related but not identical concept is bundling, which is a situation in which multiple products are sold as one. In some cases, we can view tying sales and bundling as anti-competitive. However, in other cases, they may be legal and even common. It is common for people to purchase season tickets to a sport team or a set of concerts, so to guarantee tickets to the few contests or shows that are most popular and likely to sell out. Computer software manufacturers may often bundle a number of different programs even when the buyer wants only a few. Think about the software that is included in a new computer purchase, for example. Most true monopolies today in the US are regulated natural monopolies. A natural monopoly poses a difficult challenge for competition policy because the structure of cost and demand make competition unlikely or costly. A natural monopoly arises when average costs are declining over the range of production that satisfies market demand. This typically happens when fixed costs are large relatively to variable costs. As a result, one firm is able to supply the total quantity demanded in the market at lower cost than two or more firms. So splitting up the natural monopoly could raise the average cost of production and force consumers to pay more. Public utilities, the companies that have traditionally provided water and electrical service across much of the United States, are leading examples of natural monopoly. It would make little sense to argue that a local water company should be divided into several competing companies, each with its own separate set of pipes and water supplies. Installing 4 or 5 identical sets of pipes under a city, one for each water company, so that each household would choose its own water provider would be terribly costly. What then is the appropriate competition policy for a natural monopoly? This figure illustrates the case of natural monopoly with a market demand curve that cuts through the downward sloping portion of the average cost curve. Points A, B, C, and F illustrate 4 of the main choices for regulation. The first possibility is to leave the natural monopoly alone. In this case, the monopoly will follow its normal approach to maximizing profits by producing at the quantity where marginal revenue MR equals marginal cost MC, and by then looking to the market demand curve to see what price to charge for this quantity. This monopoly will produce at point A with a quantity of 4 and a price of 9.3. If antitrust regulators split this company exactly in half, then each half would produce at point B with the average cost of $9.75 and output of 2 units. This is not very efficient because the costs are higher than when there was only one big monopolist. The regulators might require the firm to produce where marginal cost crosses the market demand curve at point C. This rule is appealing because it requires price to be set equal to marginal cost, which is what would occur in a perfectly competitive market, and it could assure consumers a higher quantity and lower price than at the monopoly choice A. However, if the firm is required to produce at a quantity of 8 and sell at a price of $3.5 per unit, the firm will suffer from losses. The most likely choice is point F, where the firm is required to produce a quantity of 6 and charge a price of $6.5. This plan makes some sense at an intuitive level. Let the natural monopoly charge enough to cover its average cost and earn a normal rate of profit so that it can continue operating but prevent the firm from raising prices and earning abnormally high monopoly profits as it would at the monopoly choice A. Determining this level of output and price with the political pressures, time constraints, and limited information of the real world is much harder than identifying the point on a graph. Regulators of public utilities used to follow the general approach of letting the natural monopoly charge enough to cover its average cost and earn a normal rate of profit so that it can continue operating but prevent the firm from raising prices and earning abnormally high monopoly profits. They calculated the average cost of production for the water or electricity companies, added in an amount for the normal rate of profit the firm should expect to earn, and set the price for consumers accordingly. This method was known as cost-plus regulation. Cost-plus regulation raises difficulties of its own. If producers receive reimbursement for their costs plus a bit more, then at a minimum producers have less reason to be concerned with high costs because they can just pass them along in higher prices. Worse, firms under cost-plus regulation even have an incentive to generate high costs by building huge factories or employing many staff because what they can charge is linked to the cost they incur. Therefore, in the 1980s and 1990s, some public utility regulators began to use price cap regulation, where the regulator sets a price that the firm can charge over the next few years. A common pattern was to require a price that declined slightly over time. If the firm can find ways to reducing its costs more quickly than the price caps, it can make a high level of profits. However, if the firm cannot keep up with the price caps or suffers bad luck in the market, it may suffer losses. A few years down the road, the regulators will then set a new series of price caps based on the firm's performance. Price cap regulation requires delicacy. It will not work if the price regulators set the price cap unrealistically low. It may not work if the market changes dramatically so that the firm is doomed to incurring losses no matter what it does. Say, if energy prices rise dramatically on world markets, then the companies selling natural gas or heating oil to homes may not be able to meet price caps that seemed reasonable a year or two ago. However, if the regulators compare the prices with producers of the same good in other areas, they can, in effect, pressure a natural monopoly in one area to compete with the prices changed in other areas. Moreover, the possibility of earning greater profits or experiencing losses instead of having an average rate of profit locked in every year by cost-plus regulation can provide the natural monopoly with incentives for efficiency and innovation. With natural monopoly, market competition is unlikely to take root, so if consumers are not to suffer the high prices and restricted output of an unrestricted monopoly, government regulation will need to play a role. In attempting to design a system of price cap regulation with flexibility and incentive, government regulators do not have an easy task. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. See you next time.